Well, good afternoon. It's not afternoon yet, so good morning, friends. It is good to be with you as we gather for this second presentation on the potential financial impact of affordable housing development on our campus. I think I know most everybody here, and you're going to have a chance to hear from our presenters in a second, but if I don't, or if you're with us online, my name's Will Green. I'm the lead pastor here. Can you hear me now? There we go. Okay, I'm going to put the microphone right next to my face. If you're with us online, we are monitoring the chat and the comments. So if you have questions throughout our presentation, please feel free to ask those there. A quick word about why we're here and what we're up to in this process. So not quite 9 weeks ago, we began an intentional discernment process to decide or figure out if God was calling us to build affordable housing on our campus. That was follow-up from a feasibility study that was done at no cost to the congregation by the Greater Washington District of the Baltimore Washington Annual Conference. I think that's the most complicated phrase I'm going to be using today. This discernment process, we've been exploring three kind of buckets of concern. What is the social impact of a project of this scale, both for us as a congregation and those who would call any development home? The financial impact, so both how does it impact our finances as a congregation, and how will it potentially impact the finances of our neighbors who might be living there? And the design impact, so actually thinking about what do we want any kind of development to look like. That last presentation will be on May 13th at 10 a.m. in our sanctuary. So May 13th at 10 a.m. in our sanctuary. And in between the presentations, there are round tables that are intentionally small groups designed to elicit your feedback, questions, and concerns. So if you hear nothing else I say today, hear that the most important thing you can do in order to participate in the conversation is to sign up for one of those round tables. And if you would like to sign up for one, you can email discernment at Silver Spring UMCP, and a member of our discernment team, our vision team, will respond. Can I ask the members of our vision team that are with us to rise so that folks can see who you are? So you'll see we've got several folks with us. We have several others that are traveling this week. Thank you so much. And finally, note that on June 4th at 11:30 a.m., we will meet with our district superintendent in a special charge conference to vote on two things. This is important. We're not voting on a final plan. We're not voting on what a building will look like. We're voting on whether or not we want to empower a building committee who would, on our behalf, negotiate a development agreement and begin the process of actually realizing in bricks and mortar what we've been talking about in our discernment process. Does that make sense to folks? So that gathering will be to elect a building committee who will then spend a season working with whichever partners we identify to actually realize the dream that we're dreaming up right now. We don't know how long that process will take. I have some preferred timelines in my head, but the preacher's not in charge, and that's probably a good thing. So friends, at this point, I'm going to invite our partners from Habitat for Humanity and Arlington Housing Corporation to join me here at the front of our sanctuary, and they're going to lead us through our presentation today. Alan, if you would introduce yourself and then take us where you want us to go.
Good morning. It's a beautiful day to be together to explore this exciting opportunity. My name is Alan Goldstein. I'm the Vice President of Real Estate Development for AHC Inc. We are a mission-oriented developer of affordable housing. Our affordable housing is in service-enriched communities where we have residents that we seek to support in the communities that we commit as long-term affordable rentals. We are a not-for-profit business operated and at this point, we have over 9,000 units at 54 communities throughout the region. So we are having probably 18 to 20,000 individuals calling our communities home each evening. It's a very exciting opportunity to talk to another church that has the potential to utilize its land for the same type of purpose. So I'm here today, as the pastor mentioned, we're going to have a broad agenda. I'm here with colleagues from AHC's Resident Services team, who will be speaking to our impact on the residents that we serve, our partners from Habitat for Humanity, who will be speaking with me about a joint venture that we have underway just up the street here at Randolph and Veers Mill. We have an exciting project going on there. Well, we're excited to be here at Silver Spring United Methodist Church to talk about utilizing this fabulous site, as the pastor said, to help you through your discernment process to taking action on whether or not to move ahead. What's beautiful about this opportunity, and I would direct you to the third slide in our presentation, second page, slide number 3, is that what's important here, as the pastor said, is not to talk about the design of a building, the cost of a project, the length, the process that we'll go through, but rather to talk about the impact that we're going to have on human beings, to talk about the mission alignment between what the church is seeking to achieve and what our organizations offer in terms of our mission. We can then get to the process by which we go through that, etc. So what I'd like to do is introduce Susan to talk about the need for affordable housing, the impact that we have on our residents, and then our agenda is going to take us through the real estate development process, financing tools to develop both affordable rental and home ownership, and then getting really into the weeds to talk about some of the considerations that the church will want to think through as we contemplate a development agreement or a joint venture and the considerations that would be involved there. And the materials that we'll cover are responsive to a series of questions the pastor Will helpfully shared with us. So, Susan, thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Davidson, and I am the Vice President of Resident Services at AHC. I've been there about 5.5 years. I would appreciate it if you'd indulge me for just a moment as I share my personal joy and excitement to stand here with you and to share the programs of AHC's Resident Services. My father was a United Methodist minister for 60 plus years in the state of South Carolina, if you're wondering where this comes from. So the United Methodist Church was my consistent home as he served numerous communities during my childhood. So it's good to be home with you today. It's a full circle moment for me. It was in the United Methodist Church that the seeds of a social justice calling were planted and nurtured. The United Methodist Church proclaims the value of each person as a unique child of God and commits itself to the healing and wholeness of all persons. Scripture and United Methodist tradition affirm a vision of abundant living where all God's children have access to sufficient resources to thrive. As you heard Alan mention, it's this vision, this mission, in which AHC, Habitat America, and Silver Spring United Methodist Church align. We wouldn't be here today if you didn't already know that there's a need for affordable housing, especially in the DMV. In Montgomery County, more than 50% of renters are cost burdened, which means that they are spending more than 50% of their gross income on rent. I encourage you to look at pages 4 through 7 in the handout. I am not going to take the time to go through those with you, but it does give you more information about the affordable housing need here in our area. At AHC, we believe that having a place to live, an apartment, a room with 4 walls, simply is not enough. Resident Services supports and advocates for residents by connecting them to resources and opportunities and services that ensure housing stability, promote education and economic mobility, improve health and wellness, build resident leadership, and foster a sense of community, all on the foundation of a safe, welcoming, and joyful place to call home. Using a trauma-informed lens, we connect residents to programs and services in a supportive environment so residents can define and achieve their own success. Our Resident Services Division received the Certified Resident Engagement and Services designation in January of 2022. This is a national certification that recognizes organizations that have developed a robust commitment, capacity, and competency in providing resident service coordination and affordable rental housing. Let's fast forward, really. I won't say how long, but let's fast forward a bit and imagine that there is a new community here on this site. As residents begin to come in, resident services is there to greet them, to assess their strengths and the opportunities for that community. We'll establish an annual plan that aligns with the residents' goals and provide supports that bridge the equity gaps that often impede persons of color and persons with lower incomes. It is from this stable foundation, this home, that residents can take steps necessary to achieve their aspirations. My contact is on page 43. Please feel free during this process to reach out to me at any time if you would like to learn a little bit more about how we can come together to serve residents who may be living here in your community. And now I'd like to welcome Jeff Dee, the president of Habitat for Humanity Metro Maryland, to share the news of an exciting opportunity to provide affordable home ownership. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. I just want to briefly talk about Habitat for Humanity. Have any of you ever volunteered? I mean, I know we've had a great relationship here. That's awesome. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Habitat, and then I'm going to bring our VP of Community Development, Sarah Redinger, up, and she's going to talk more about the project. But the context I want to give you for Habitat for Humanity, forgive me if some of you already know this, Habitat for Humanity was started or came out of the seed of Habitat for Humanity was planted in a place called Koinonia Farm in rural Georgia in the 1920s and 30s, and they were trying to live out first century Christianity. And what happened was there was a gentleman called Clarence Jordan. He started this farm, and the point of the farm was to bring whites and blacks together and to live in harmony with each other. And they lived together, they worked together, and they ate together. And I keep bringing that up because I find it fascinating that the violence started when they ate together. It wasn't when they were living together or working side by side. It was when they were eating together. The goal of the farm was, as I said, to live out first century Christianity. It still exists today. I still get emails from them. They paid equal wages, regardless whether a person was white or black. And there were bombings of their farm stand, and they survived through the civil rights era into the 60s, and then they came to a point where they said, what are we going to do now? How are we going to change with the times? So they came up with a couple of different concepts. The one relevant here is called partnership housing, and the way it worked was it's a very simple concept. Is they brought people together to raise money, and they built a house with, not for, and there's a really important distinction for those of you who've already worked with us. We always say with a family, not for a family. So they built a house with one family, then they took that money, they took the mortgage payment, which was zero interest, biblical economics, zero interest, no profit, and then they raised more money and they built the next house and the next house. So then in the early 60s, there was a couple, Linda and Miller Fuller, who were having a marriage crisis. They were millionaires back when $1 million was a lot of money. I mean, it's a lot of money now, but it was really a lot of money then. And short story was, Linda Fuller had said to Millard, you can have your money or you can have your marriage, make a choice. And he made the right choice. He followed her to New York. They gave up all their money. they found themselves down in Georgia, and they came across Koinonia Farm, and they were just going to stay for the afternoon. That was their intent. They wanted to just drop in for the afternoon. They ended up staying for months and years. And they took this concept of partnership housing and went to Africa and perfected it, then brought it back to Americus, Georgia, and they started in 1976 Habitat for Humanity. And we're now the world's largest nonprofit housing builder. And I always say Jimmy Carter made us famous. Well, he did make us famous. But it was kind of a funny story how he got involved, because after he got out of office, my understanding was there was an editorial in a local paper, President Carter's got to do something, he's got to get involved. And he's like, well, who are these people? And it was Millard and Linda Fuller. And so he and Mrs. Carter met with them, and they walked away with like a list of 10 things that they said Millard and Linda said would like you to do. And they said, all right, well, we think we'll do one of them. And they ended up doing all of them. And, so in 1982, Habitat for Humanity came to Montgomery County. And we expanded in 2013 into Prince George's County. So we're Habitat for Humanity Metro Maryland. We're one of 1,100 affiliates across the country. And we have built, we're working on our 102nd or 103rd house right now. Well, not right now, but yesterday they were working on our 103rd house. We still issue 0% mortgages. We work with the families. They have homeowner education classes, what it means to be a homeowner. They learn all about civic engagement, et cetera, like that. So that's the history of Habitat, where we have come. We have a lot of exciting things. They've talked about Randolph Road, which is awesome, and we have some other things in the works. And now I want to turn it over to Sarah, who will answer more questions. She's she's the expert for us. So she'll answer any more. I'll get out of her way. Okay.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. So I just wanted to talk really quickly before Alan dives into the development process and we dive into financing. I just wanted to talk briefly about the need for affordable homeownership in Montgomery County. This is a massive challenge in our county, as I'm sure you all know and have experienced yourselves. But I think it's on page 10 in your slides. I've got a number of charts that I'll just briefly sort of walk through. But the planning department recently released additional data on homeownership from the past year or two. And last year, the average sold price for a single-family detached home was over $940,000. $940,000. For an attached home, that drops to a little over $420,000, so that's townhomes and condos, but still incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult for folks to get into homeownership, particularly when you have to save a down payment. On top of that, and I think this is really kind of interesting, if you look at the next chart, it talks about the types of mortgages or the types of purchases that people use to buy homes in Montgomery County. And the one that I want to point out is the FHA loans. And the percentage of homes purchased in Montgomery County with FHA loans is shrinking. And that's really important to note because first-time homebuyers typically use FHA loans and folks at lower incomes. So it's becoming more and more difficult for folks who qualify for FHA to actually be able to purchase a home in Montgomery County. The next slide dives a little bit more deeply into that and looks at the net increase or decrease in home ownership by income level. So the median income for households to own a home or that own homes in Montgomery County is $150,000. The average median or area median income according to HUD is $142,000. So that's even above what the median income in the county is. And really the only income level that saw a net increase in home ownership over the past 11 years were households earning over $150,000. And then finally, I just want to take a look at this from a racial and ethnic lens, right? So in the county, we have about 65% home ownership. And white households own about 78%. 78% of white households own their homes versus rent. So there is an increasing gap between white households and Black and African American households that own their homes, and that has now increased to a 36% gap. So we have just tremendous equity issues when it comes to homeownership, which are really magnified when you think about the fact that homeownership is the primary way that we build wealth. And typically, you'll see about a 10 times wealth difference between white households and Black and African American households. And a huge part of that is because of lack of access to homeownership, both historically and currently. And so that's one of the reasons that Habitat is so passionate about what we do. It's why we get up and do what we do every day. We want to make sure that we are decreasing that equity gap in homeownership and making sure that we are helping families of all races and all ethnicities build transformational generational wealth. So with that, I'm going to stop. We'll turn it over to Alan. I'm sorry. He'll go through the development process, and then I'll come back and talk about how we finance homeownership, which is also a challenge.
It's always challenging to follow Sarah's passion and knowledge of the industry. But what I'd like to do is take what you've heard for the last couple minutes and put it in the context of our conversation. As we met with Pastor Will and subsequently met with the Vision team, we were told about a vision where the church is contemplating utilizing its land to further social justice through providing affordable home ownership and affordable rental housing. So at this point in time, having given you a little sense of who our organizations are and trying to show that alignment between what it is you're seeking to do and the abilities, we're going to get a little deeper into the weeds. So I'm going to use a bunch of jargon, we're going to move quickly, but at any point in time, if it would be helpful to clarify a term or expand on a concept, please stop me, because this is very much a conversation, and while we'll do most of the talking, if it's not clearly and logically working its way to respond to the issues that brought you here to learn about, then please help us help you. So that said, the reference we've made a couple times is that Habitat and AHC teamed up together right up the road at the corner of Randolph and Veers Mill. So whether your frame of reference is the Dunkin' Donuts kitty corner, the McDonald's there, the Korean corner, we took a county-owned site of 6 acres, and what we're doing there is we're providing 168, yes ma'am? Absolutely, and not only that, it is on page, slide 40 shows what we're looking at, also slide 2. And what I wanted to briefly speak to is the notion that a parcel of land can become a community through a visioning process just like this. This project, it took 2 to 3 years to get to construction start, and next November we'll be moving in 168 families into deeply affordable rental housing. We saw some of the income levels on slide 5. We'll be serving households at 30, 40, 50, and 60% of the area median income. These are our Safeway clerks. These are the people driving our buses, educating our children. Yes, sir. Excellent question. How do we select our residents? So we have third-party professional management. We use a screening process similar to any other rental community, except that on top of that, we have a formal income certification process, so that you are applying for a unit that has a rent commensurate with your income, so that your household will be paying for rent and utilities no more than 30% of your gross household income. Is that helpful? Correct. People will apply. We have a website. We will market it. People will apply. It is not through a government agency. We are not the Housing Opportunities Commission. We are a private, not-for-profit organization doing this out of a sense of mission and commitment. Yes, please. It's an excellent question, and I can get back to you with a more detailed response than I could give at the moment, but yes, it does involve a look at credit, a look at criminality. Susan, is that anything you can speak to?
There are some, we are looking at those things now, as we all know, that people who
And thank you for those questions. So we're having a dialogue here. So we're going to have 168 rental apartments here, serving larger households. We're going to have 3 and 4 bedroom units. We're going to have a child care facility in this particular building. We have partnerships with food distribution organizations. We do quite a number of things that align with what I understand to be the social justice ministries of the church here. And then the beautiful part of what we were able to do here is these 2 buildings here, each of which house 12 homes, are structured as for ownership condominiums and will achieve all of those objectives that Sarah just talked about. So when you think about how do we do home ownership and rental and we'll start to get technical, a single plan of finance, a single zoning approval. So that's what we were able to do here through the magic of condominiumization and financial structuring, is that we're achieving both of those missions, and then we're going to operate them synergistically so that they're efficient by sharing contractual obligations for things as mundane as maintenance, landscaping, etc. So that's why I think that we offer an exciting opportunity to dialogue with you to see how it is potentially you can realize your vision through some of these capabilities. I'd like to talk through just very quickly a couple examples of partnering with houses of worship where we've done some interesting things. On slide 14, please, on page 7. The Episcopal Church of the Resurrection was very much in a similar situation as the congregation here, looking to further a social justice ministry through housing. It had quite an outdated building. You sort of walked by and wondered if it was 60s or 70s. And their congregation was looking to both recapitalize and renovate their worship and ministry space, as well as to provide affordable housing. So as you can see in the 3 little pictures there, we were able to get zoning approval for a 113-unit affordable apartment building, and we subdivided the land there. We got permission from the Archdiocese out of Richmond. The bishop blessed the notion that we could ground lease the majority of the site for affordable housing for a 99-year term with I think a single 99-year extension. And there were some questions about ground leases that we can talk about. And then the white sanctuary space, which you can see with the cross on it, is the church's embodiment of what it was looking to do for its purposes, for its ministry. And they exist side by side on the same piece of land. And again, it's an example that you can contemplate as you're thinking about what you're looking to do here. And I'm always happy to pull together a group, and whether we do a bus tour or meet on site or what have you, sometimes seeing is believing. If we look on slide 15, you can see what that concept looked like when we were in the zoning phase. There were 2 footprints that sat on the site that needed to get through a zoning process that we'll talk about, financing that we'll talk about at great length, ultimately be constructed, and those units are now occupied by households at a range of income levels and family sizes. At page 16, at the bottom of page 8, another nice example, St. James Church in Alexandria it had a different goal. I brought 3 different examples. One was redevelopment of the church, one will be an outright land sale, the other being a joint venture. In this instance, the church was looking to capitalize on the value of its land and move. So they were willing to sell us the land parcel, and what they did that furthered the mission is typically people want to go under contract on land at a market price and close in 90 days for cash. We can't do that. We want to take a parcel of land with a mission into a process, work with a mission-aligned partner on the land, go through a zoning process, understand the timing of a financing process that we'll talk about in a little bit, and ultimately, jointly get to that goal further down the road. But the participation of the patient land seller is what enables affordable housing to work its magic. So it's fun to be in these conversations with mission-oriented houses of worship. As you can see what we did here on slide 17, the land was expensive. So in order to write down the cost of the land for the affordable housing, we actually did what's called a subdivision, created 2 parcels, zoned one for market rate townhomes, sold them off to a market rate developer who paid us a pretty penny for the land, and we used that to subsidize the cost of land under the affordable housing to the point that it became consistent with the typical costs of an affordable housing development in the Washington metro area. And in partnership with the city of Alexandria, the state of Virginia, and half a dozen other financing sources we were able to get sources to equal uses, because ultimately that becomes the biggest challenge of the process. At the bottom of page 9, Macedonian Baptist Church. Yes, please. Do you know how many acres you have? So I'm going to answer the question by saying that we came well prepared to address the questions and to move into a process that was discussed. But other than looking just for a minute at the sketches done by an architect, I haven't studied that. My instinct tells me we're certainly sizable enough to retain or recreate major portions of this church, have room for home ownership, as well as a sizable multifamily building. So that's me avoiding the question. Okay. Now, So Jeff, I'm going to respond to that by saying that AHC has been in this business for a long time. I was speaking about that with one of your congregants just here during the fellowship hour, is that we've been doing this for almost 50 years. We have 54 communities. We've now done a dozen new construction communities, and we have completed 3 partnerships with faith-based organizations, which are the ones that I'm walking through here. So it is a niche industry. And this is what we do, this is what we focus on, it's what we love to do. So again, it's exciting to be part of these conversations wherever it is that the path may lead. This Thursday, yes please. Only every day. Fabulous question. You're a little bit ahead of my agenda, but let me respond to it because you've teed up an important question in people's mind. Ultimately, what will happen, most likely in this sort of an instance, is that the church will either be the ground lessor or the land seller. There will be a separate legal entity. All of this is sort of making the base assumption now and for the rest of the presentation that you move ahead. There would be a separate legal entity set up, typically an LLC or a limited partnership, that would be comprised of a general partner entity that, getting way ahead of ourselves, could be a joint venture with the church and AHC. A separate legal entity, should we proceed also with home ownership, to take ownership of a portion of the site. But ultimately, this would be done by a secular entity that was set up for furtherance of this purpose, and the vast majority of the capital that would come forward, and I use the term capital to mean money. It could be debt, it can be equity, it could be government money, it could be private money. All of that becomes what we refer to as the capital stack. We'll see a picture of that in a few minutes. Most of the money is private sector. We will get a loan from a bank. We will get tax credits that will be invested in, as we'll talk about, from a profitable corporation looking to achieve Community Reinvestment Act credits per the banking regulations. Only when those sources of funds prove inadequate to fully fund the initiative do we start talking to our governmental partners about filling what we call the financing gap. And that's where the negotiations come in. And let me step into this just a little bit further. I'm from Montgomery County. I skipped over this before. Susan, thank you for putting yourself in context. Perhaps I should do the same because I'm going to yap on for a while here. I was raised right there next to Northwood High School, graduated from Kennedy. My wife, my 3 kids, and I, we live over in Kensington, and I'm going to take the liberty of sharing what I think is a fun story. I'm actually quite comfortable in a Methodist sanctuary because my faith congregation, Bethel Synagogue on Old Georgetown Road, typically gets overflow congregations attendance on the Jewish high holidays. So we have a partnership with our faith partner across the street, Bethesda United Methodist Church, and many a time I have worshiped in Bethesda United Methodist Church. We did the kids' service downstairs, the family service upstairs, and it was kind of a fun memory as I've been participating in these conversations, thinking about the nexus, and not only the physical nexus, but also the way that the social justice mission, the tikkun olam, the repair the world notion of Judaism, aligns exactly with what you've been talking about with the beloved community and the mission orientation of the Methodists. And if I went any further, I'd quickly be out of my depth, but it's a very comfortable feeling as we all pursue social justice. I have just one more observation, please. If we're talking about the need ultimately for a limited resource of government support, government financial support for an initiative, you're looking for a couple of things to be of most impact to the households that we serve. Access to transit, we're walking distance to Metro. Access to employment, we're right here at downtown Silver Spring. Access to excellent schools. So all of the things that we would wish when not only providing a solution that's housing, but a solution that is comprehensive to enable our residents and our households to succeed, gets me really excited about the opportunity that you are putting forward by being willing to consider, with all the entailed risks and rewards, utilizing this land to further that mission. Yes, please. Yes. So to my knowledge, neither of those congregations has pursued a larger scale affordable home ownership initiative, but I do know there are various congregations with different aspects to their ministries. Thank you again for both the conversation and for the prompt to keep moving along. On slide, page 10, slide 20. And we've put together, and again, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who've been so helpful in putting this all together. I'm just the voice here. But we wanted to put together a visual to give you a sense of the development process. As you can see there, we'll go through an initial development process, we'll prepare for closing, we'll build a building, and then we'll operate it. That process that just took 30 seconds in my remarks will take 5 years, many meetings, many hundreds of stakeholders, millions of dollars of investment. But it's an exciting process. It's a process that allows you to take a vision and turn it into, you were referencing bricks and mortar during your sermon, in a metaphorical kind of way, so I'm here now speaking about it in a literal way. We're literally undertaking this journey of transformation together. It'll be physical, spiritual, and emotional to reflect the values of the congregation and of our organizations in the community that we're trying to seek. What we do is we try to take a systematic and analytical approach to development that would take the land parcel in question here and seek to have all stakeholders participate in a conversation so that ultimately we're reflecting the values that we're seeking to achieve in the community that we create. So the initial pre-development slide talks about identifying an opportunity. Well, we're already sitting here, so the hard part is that's taken care of. Now the question is, what can we do with this land? There's a balancing act during which we're simultaneously trying to develop a preliminary housing program that, as we talked about, could be multifaceted with home ownership and rental, to address local housing needs that Sarah talked about, factor in construction and financing costs, which is sort of my comfort zone, provide access to transit, determine the availability of the local resources that this gentleman asked about, and about 1,000 other factors that we'll be trying to put together into a single program that ultimately can get to the closing table and become home to households. We're very fortunate to be sitting here together on a fairly flat, rectangular site within walking distance of downtown. I did hear in one of the conversations that we've had that we are also fortunate to have a river run through it, and there are any number of springs below the site. So I saw a vision from the architect of an underground parking garage that we have an expert construction team on staff, but maybe there might be different ways to think about handling parking rather than sticking it down below grade. And then I always like to say, especially when we're this close to transit, the more we can invest our time and energy and resources on housing the people rather than housing the cars, the better. So, thank you. First thing we'll do is we'll undertake zoning and site analysis. There are experts in all of these fields. We've done a number of developments in Montgomery County, and again, I emphasize that this is right up the street. We just went through the process. We went through the same park and planning individuals. We partnered with the same government agencies. We obtained the same sources of financing that would be needed here for a transaction that just closed in November. The exciting thing there, if you were to go by the site, it just looks like dirt, but it's not. We've actually gone down and come back up, having put in the utility infrastructure, the stormwater management, and all the other things. And while we were below grade, we did not find any storage tanks. We did not find any springs or any of the other scary things that happen when you are below ground. And pretty soon what we'll start to see will be the construction coming out of the ground. The foundations will get poured, the buildings will get framed, they'll start to look like homes. And again, at any point in time that it's helpful to experience that, it can bring a lot of insights into the conversation to actually sort of walk a site and feel what could be involved. We would analyze the existing zoning, determine whether or not a rezoning was required. And again, ma'am, to your question, we have not studied the site on purpose, but rather are seeking to help further a conversation. That's certainly the exciting part when you engage a zoning attorney and an architect and a civil engineer who combine their skill sets and experience to determine a range of possibilities. So that's when it starts to get real. And if you look at slide 21, that's where it starts to get real. This is the notion of what a circulation pattern might look like, what building footprints could look like, how pedestrians and vehicles interact, how to utilize the site both externally and internally, and simultaneously you're thinking about energy considerations and the housing program, and all of these things are happening even as you're going with your vision from broader to more narrow and specific. I'm aware that there have been some conversations getting insights from park and planning, so fortunate to know that you are heading in a direction that generally seems achievable. So the preliminary assessment that an architect did for you, which was certainly quite helpful in getting my mind going, it showed over 160 apartments and I believe about 10 townhomes. The range, the scope of what you could achieve here is quite magnificent. This is a tremendous impact on hundreds of individuals in hundreds of families over generations that can be the outcome of this process. So the goal is to clearly define the desired outcomes and then move to a point where we are working with the team to create a schematic design. The schematic design on a simultaneous track, our team will be undertaking financial analyses. We'll be simultaneously working with the zoning, the legal considerations, the financing partners, so that ultimately we'll have 5 or 6 major trains on somewhat parallel tracks, all seeking to get to the station, the closing table at the same time. Yes, please. I appreciate the question, and your notion that it's complicated is accurate, but if again I could turn to Susan, I know that we've done some work as there have been international crises over the past few years trying to address that need within our existing portfolio.
We did during the Afghanistan crisis. We worked with the resettlement agencies. We got rid of all of that background checking because you cannot background check, a refugee. We got rid of all of those things and worked with the resettlement agencies with an agreement that they pay a portion of that rent until the person can get the way, and self-sufficient. All the while working with resident services as well. So it can be done. They weren't set aside units, but we did have some vacancies, and in fact did house and continue to house some of those refugees.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you, Susan. At the bottom of page 11, slide 22, one of my all-time favorites, a real live picture. These are fellow congregants over at the Episcopal Church of the Resurrection, where on their equivalent of a June 4th, 98% of the congregation voted to proceed with the initiative. And we were honored to be selected as the partner, and ultimately we went on this journey together that we're talking about. We successfully pulled together the resources, and the spire, which is what we named our building, next to the new sanctuary is up and running. So let's assume we proceed. Let's run through the next couple of years in a minute. On page 12, we've got a little schematic that shows you the process that we would go through. And we're going to keep this probably at about the 10,000 foot level, so if you have granular questions, please ask, but otherwise, what I got a sense would be helpful would be to introduce people to concepts within a framework. We can always go deeper, but my sense is if you understand the arc of what we're trying to do and the components thereof, that we can always go deeper. Always glad to come back. I live just up the street. So once we would have a vision that was embodied in a specific picture on a building, as we've seen a few examples, we would do a formal zoning submission, coordinate community outreach with our neighbors, and I know that there's engagement here between the congregation and the civic associations, which couldn't be more helpful as you seek to align a change in the use of the neighborhood and the roadways and all the other things, the view sheds, all of this comes into consideration, and enter the public review process. Identify financing partners, which we'll talk about again in just another minute. Post zoning approval, convert those schematic drawings that have now been approved by the zoning into constructible drawings that can be permitted for building permits. So we're putting together our financing, we have approved zoning, we're getting a building permit, and they all meet at that train station I mentioned before, and at the same time we would transact on the land, close on the financing, and in effect commence construction. And that's what we did at Randolph in November. Construction, whatever building we're going to design, it's going to take 22 months to build. They always say it's 22 months. It'll be 20, it'll be 24. It might depend on those springs that run under the site. Lease up, and in this instance, sales. Habitat has a unique model that Sarah can speak to more, and particularly if you'd like to hear another voice and want a question for her, please. Stabilized operations, where we are collecting revenues, we are paying our expenses, and we are taking our construction loan and converting it over to permanent financing. Yes, please.
And when you say we, you're talking about that private LLC in which the church is a part.
Correct. Thank you for that. Correct. So this is happening on the back nine, if anybody's a golfer. And the church itself, you've raised some interesting questions, if I may, about needs to address deferred maintenance, perhaps either rebuild, reconceive, renovate some of the functional spaces or the administrative spaces. And those are all things that once we've got goals on a page can be incorporated into a structure. And then one of your questions was about funding and will the church need to raise funding? It would in relation to those things that are separate and distinct from the affordable housing itself.
So air conditioning.
And one of the things that we did is at the Episcopal Church of the Resurrection, which was that small white sanctuary next to the apartment building. What the church ground leased us the church, as I mentioned, for 2 centuries. What we did is we said, rather than pay you X dollars per year, why don't we figure out the value of that stream of income over the length of the lease and pay it all to you today? And I think we wrote him a check for $4.2 million. And don't want to go too far with stretching the metaphor, but it was within 10% of the cost of doing the sanctuary. So somebody was looking out for the church because it was an appraised value, and the resources generated through the contribution of the land, monetizing that, enabled them to achieve their goals. Now, one of the questions that you'll have to consider is that the value of the land itself is one of the things that's going to close the financing gap that we keep making reference to. So are you selling it into the venture? This was the Episcopal Church of the Resurrection in Alexandria in the Beauregard area. Correct. Yeah. And if it would be helpful to talk to Reverend Joe, she went through the whole process and knows it pretty well. Yes, please. Another question that I got that I'm going to put out there before one of you asks is, how are we going to pay for all of this? Even before we get to a viable program and a financing and a this and that. There are resources out there for pre-development money. This is what's called the pre-development process. There are grants and loans, and perhaps the church has resources and AHC has resources, and all of these things that we could talk about in more detail become negotiations, and they become part of that development agreement that you referenced. And ultimately, in a transparent dialogue, we figure out what works for everybody and how we share the risks of undertaking such a venture. Okay, anybody need to stand up and stretch before we talk financing? Okay, anything that I've missed? Okay, thank you. On slide 12 at the bottom, we talked about the sources and uses of financing. I think Jeff might have asked this question before. Has anybody purchased a home at some point in time? All right, I'm seeing hands and nods. It's the same. All right, let me find my notes. And particularly if you could imagine for a moment with me your first home, because it becomes a much better analogy. So you went out with your youthful enthusiasm and your early in your career income, and you got the mortgage that you could support. The biggest one the bank would approve you for that you could sleep at night with. But the home that you were buying was pretty darn expensive, even though it was modest and in an area you wanted to be in. So you pulled together all your pennies, and that was going to be your down payment, and you had your down payment and your loan, and you looked around, and you were still $26,000 short of the closing table, $120,000, whatever that number might be. So whether you called your parents, like I did, or had other sources of support in the community, or if you bought it with a partner, or whatever your circumstances might have been, if we work with the notion of a loan, debt, equity, which could be cash, or it could be this complicated process of monetizing future tax benefits through the low-income housing tax credit, it's a mouthful, you're still going to end up with a financing gap given the high cost of construction and the fact that what we're trying to do is build something that is beautiful and expensive and then rent it out at below its market value. We're inherently set up not to have enough money to do what we want to do. The county's budget this year is over $5.5 billion. There's a housing initiative fund that exists solely for this purpose, and AHC has partnered up with the county now, I think 7 times. We've acquired over 1,300 units. We're building 200 units. So we have a long history of partnership, of working with the county council, the county executive. I saw your county council member the other day. She was at the Affordable Housing Conference in Montgomery County, so I know that Kate Stewart is all excited that you're having this conversation. So it becomes a pretty small world. But ultimately, we're looking to put together debt, equity, and then that gap financing, which would most likely primarily come from the local jurisdiction in partnership with the state. It is interesting to get to the order of magnitude that we're talking about in terms of dollars. If we look, just jumping ahead for a second, please. On page 21, slide 42. As I mentioned quickly a few minutes ago, this was 168 rental units and 24 affordable home ownership opportunities plus 3 single-family homes. This was a $96 million undertaking in total, and what you're talking about doing is 160-ish apartments plus some additional townhomes. So this is a big project. Big project. I just want people to have a sense of what we're talking about here. New construction in this area is probably $450,000 to $500,000 a unit in total development costs. As we can see here, we talked about the capital stack, and I got a sense from some of the questions I was receiving that specifics could be helpful. So look at these sources of funding. We got a loan. We got equity through a tax credit. If you think about the tax credit that perhaps many of you have utilized to offset the cost of raising those expensive children, there's a similar notion out there where you can get a tax credit for developing affordable housing. So if you do that on a larger scale, you can bring significant cash to the table. The state of Maryland stepped up with $5.5 million for this initiative, believing in the outcomes that it represented. Montgomery County invested $23 million in this Randolph Road development, which was a larger number even than expected because, as we talked about, we are serving large families at deep levels of affordability. It could have been done for less, but this was focused on the mission outcomes, not just getting the sources to equal uses. We won some funding from the Federal Home Loan Bank. There's a Maryland Energy Efficiency, HA loan. And then ultimately, this one is of relevance to the congregation, is that the county put the land into the deal for $1. Because of the somewhat complicated structure that we'll take a quick look at, you actually can't take anything into the tax credit partnership at below its market value. So the county sold us as a corporation the land for $1. We then sold it into the partnership for its market value, but in exchange for an obligation to repay, not for any actual cash. So it becomes a structuring issue for the lawyers and the lenders and others in the congregation. It's actually good fun. All right. Let me know when I'm pushing my luck on going into detail. But again, I did get the sense in a series of conversations that starting to peel back some of the levels of what's going on here would be a greater comfort level for the church rather than just a generic notion of we're going to do good with our land. So on slide 13 at the top, the idea is that we would set up a tax credit limited partnership. It would obtain an allocation of these tax credits. We would partner up with a construction lender. We would have a permanent lender ready to be the mortgage provider. And then through a structure such as what you're seeing there at the top of the page. Page 13. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm sorry, there are both pages and slide numbers. We were prepared to go big electronic screen or handouts. Thank you. The notion of soft debt is what I was referring to as the gap financing from the local jurisdiction. There is an obligation to repay it to Montgomery County, but not on a fixed schedule or even with necessarily a fixed maturity. If you get to that maturity, you haven't fully repaid it, but are in conformance with your obligations in terms of affordability and reporting and other things, there is an understanding that the county will most likely roll that forward and not move to foreclose on an affordable housing development. Another question that came up, and I'm trying to make sure to hit on all these, can the church start this process and lose the church, lose the land? Perfectly valid concern. If we think about the process that we're talking about, at no point prior to closing on the financing and transacting on the land have we put the church or its land at risk. We will probably have some dollars at risk. Those dollars can be quantified, those dollars can be capped, those risks can be shared. Enterprise has a faith-based initiative that has a grant program. There are a whole range of ways to mitigate the risks. The idea is that once you get to the closing table, the lender has done all of their scrutiny. The investor has done their due diligence. The state has scrubbed this up and down. We've all done all the things we need. We have a signed contract with a general contractor for a fixed amount of money to build whatever community is we're going to do. The Habitat component of the home ownership element is fully financed. So when we close and when the land is pledged as collateral, should that be the structure, that's the point at which time you're taking a very calculated risk that the process, the funding, the partners you put in place are all going to come through. Okay. The bottom of page 13 talks about the low-income housing tax credit. I'm going to do like Susan did and say, please take a look, and I can come back to that. But again, the notion is that for profitable banks looking to reduce their tax liability, they can make an investment in affordable housing that the regulators, the federal regulators, view fondly when contemplating whether or not to approve bank mergers. So there are a whole series of financial institutions, your Chase, Bank of America, Capital One is a close partner of AHC, that will invest in tax credits and would be eager to do so. They look to three things when entities are looking to finance this type of transaction. They want to see the location, the quality of the sponsorship team, and the quality of the asset itself. Hopefully you're getting a sense from our presentation that we only build high-quality homes that any of us would be willing to live in. The location speaks for itself, and I believe that our track record is one that will consistently enable us to attract capital partners needed to finance this sort of a venture. The top of page 14, ma'am, your eyes were wide before, but here's what it really looks like if you get to the structure for a low-income housing tax credit investment. You set up a limited partner, you put together a general partner entity, and again, I don't know if there's benefit into going into too much more detail, but that's the general gist of the major pieces of financing affordable housing. Little bit of a rush, even though I talked for a while. Could I address any questions? We were hoping to take another couple of minutes and have Sarah give a similar, I believe albeit briefer, description of how Habitat works its magic to be able to sell homes to low and very low income homeowners. Yes, please. Yes. So the county is a multi-headed hydra sort of an entity. So what I'd like to do is parse your question into sort of the key elements that people worry about from a timing perspective. If we remember, we talked about the real estate development process. The first was zoning approval. So it's not actually the county, but the Maryland National Park and Planning Commission oversees zoning in the county. Our review here, I wouldn't say it was expeditious, but it was consistently moving forward with wind in the sails. We had productive conversations. We had to engage with the state for some of the state roads. I think either Randolph or Veers Mill is a state road. We talked with the transit folks. We talked with the energy folks. It was probably 4 months of preparation and then a 4 to 5 month approval process, which is a little bit faster than you would expect. The Department of Permitting Services, again, did a fine job. We gave our architect additional time and resources to make sure that the drawings were done to the nth degree so that we didn't have to have iterative reviews. So we had our building permit as scheduled. The Department of Housing and Community Affairs controls the housing funding. It is an executive agency because here in Montgomery County, the county council, like Congress, allocates the resources and then the county executive acts on them through the agencies. So we partnered with zoning, knowing the path that we were going on with the county housing resources, needing permitting to be ready to go, and we signed a land disposition agreement with the General Services Division. Is that where Ronnie works? In the fall of 2019, perhaps, that had us closing on the transaction before anybody had heard the word COVID in October of 2022. It was, needless to say, we all had our lives experiences with COVID. From a professional perspective, it was unbelievable, from the cost increases, the construction delays, the supply chain, the difficulty of mere communication. And I'm just thrilled to say that we had built in a little bit of a cushion, and we closed in November. We were off by a month that included the entirety of COVID. So I would answer your question by complimenting all of the different agencies and stakeholders that we worked with. It really was a beautiful partnership that brought everything to the table as needed. And then back to my comment, might have lost some sleep getting up to closing, but now that everything is in place, back to this question of losing the church, it's just a question of driving by and seeing how far along they are in construction. We know we're going to achieve the rents that we need because they're affordable and they are 40% of market rents. Our operating expenses we vetted very closely. So at this point in time, the risk profile of the deal is very, very low. But was that adequate in terms of responding to the county? Okay.
And we have a commitment from our council member and official we should all support zoning tax amendments for religious
So I don't usually name drop unless it's fun, so I will. So I did a program called Leadership Montgomery back in 2010, and we sat in the shh corner where they were constantly telling us to be quiet because I sat next to someone named Goldman and someone named Glass, who is now, Evan Glass is now the president of our county council. So again, just totally fortuitous, but it's a small network, and those of us that have been involved in affordable housing and demonstrating by what it is that we do year in and year out, there would be wind in the sails from so many different quarters for an initiative like this. At Randolph, we were actually able to get an advance financing commitment before we signed the land disposition agreement. That was county-owned land. That would sort of be something to aspire to. But that would require sitting down and doing some real strategic and political analysis and see if we could get to that outcome. Yes. Sure. So let me use the example of a single-family home mortgage. When you sign the mortgage documents pledging your home as collateral to the bank, they're making you a loan in exchange for the right to take your house and the land on which it sits. So I was using the idea of pledging the land as collateral as the same general description. Now, some lenders will allow you in a ground lease structure not to have to pledge the underlying land. It gets a little bit more complicated. But as I think about it, and I thank you for the question, the Archdiocese, the Episcopal Archdiocese in Virginia wouldn't allow them to put the land at risk. So there were certain funding sources we were not able to utilize, interestingly, including the state of Virginia, where the housing agency requires a pledge of the land. So we had both a private bank construction loan and a private bank permanent loan. And in the event of a foreclosure, the lender there will take the building, but not the underlying land. And even as I say that out loud, that probably sounds like a more comfortable type of arrangement as we have this conversation.
And that's what our annual conference would require. We are not allowed, because we don't own the land, to pledge the land. The denomination owns the land. So we can't pledge it away. We can lease the ground which is, you might want to explain the ground. I'm not sure that.
Sure, it's sort of an interesting notion, but you can rent an apartment, you can also rent a piece of land. So the entity that we talked about setting up, this limited partnership or LLC that would develop the building, would also sign a ground lease with the church or the regional organization that represents the church, whoever's name is currently on the deed. And then payments due on the ground lease, we'd have to figure out how they would go through the conference and perhaps come back to the church for capital improvements or things. But the notion of a ground lease is that we'll build a building on it. It will sit there for 99 years serving its mission of affordable housing. I'll use the same example as with the Episcopal Church. They were willing to agree to a 99-year extension on the 99-year lease. So our successors, several generations ahead, ultimately, a ground lease, the LLC that owns the building for 198 years will hand the keys back to the church. And ownership will revert of both the land and whatever happens to be sitting on it at the end of the lease term. It's an interesting notion. What typically happens is that the lease would get extended and renegotiated and what have you, but in a literal legal way to think about it is that whoever used the land for the lease term, when it is over, they would get ownership of whatever is sitting upon it at that time. Is that what you wanted me to get at? Yeah. Okay. Sarah, I think I might have tired him out a little bit, but your energy will get people excited about affordable home ownership.
All right. So I'm going to just talk briefly about how we finance affordable home ownership. The development process that Alan talked about, exactly the same. Nothing different in that process. So I think we're on page 15, but basically Habitat is sort of unique. We are a builder, so we're a licensed general contractor. When we do single family homes and townhomes, we actually build them ourselves. And then we are also a lender. And I think that's particularly interesting because we underwrite our own mortgages. That's how we can provide a 0% interest mortgage with a 1% down payment. We have control over the criteria that's used when we review credit reports, so we can make sure that we are using an equitable lens when we are looking at credit. So there's a lot of interesting, flexible things that we can do. And so when folks apply to us to purchase a home, we review that application exactly like a bank would. We are looking at income to make sure they fall within the income ranges we're looking to serve. We're looking at debt to income to make sure that folks are not paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And we also look to make sure that folks don't have sort of a lot of other debt that's going to make it really difficult for them to pay their mortgage. We want to make sure that folks are successful. And in 42 years, I think, or 41 years of being in business, we have only had one default in 41 years. So this is a process that works, and it works well, and we do a significant amount of home buyer education with our buyers as well before they even get to the closing table. And so we also have a couple of interesting protections because Habitat is the lender, and I want to point these out because I think they're important. So as you all know, as I pointed out earlier, housing is incredibly expensive in this area. And so oftentimes folks can afford a mortgage, let's say at $300,000, but the home actually appraises for $500,000. So Habitat will provide a first mortgage, which is the mortgage you pay to Habitat on. But then there's that extra $200,000, and we don't want folks to get into homes, flip them, walk away with a ton of profit, and go do something else, right? That's not the point of our mission, and it's not a good use of the subsidy dollars that go into the project. So we have typically a soft second, which is a silent mortgage. It does not get paid upon every month. It just sits there on the house silently, and if the home is sold within 30 years, it gets repaid to Habitat with the proceeds of the sale. And that really prevents folks from being able to flip the home. Habitat also has the right of first repurchase. So our buyers can sell their homes anytime, but if they do, they have to offer it back to Habitat first. We have to pay market value. We can do that because we have a soft second in place. We also have the first mortgage. And so if they decide to sell, we pay market value, we buy the home back, and we make sure that it's sold to another income qualified buyer. And then finally, in many cases, we have what's called equity or appreciation sharing. And so particularly, again, in this area, as homes grow and grow and grow and their appraisals, we share that equity with the buyer. The longer they stay in the home, the more equity they earn. It's another mechanism to prevent flipping. It's another mechanism to allow Habitat to recapture some of the subsidy dollars that are put into that home, and then we can keep that home affordable in the long run. So kind of an interesting structure, but again, it does allow the buyer to earn equity to buy another home in the future, right? They can build that down payment, but it does allow Habitat to keep that home affordable sort of in the long run. In terms of how we calculate an affordable mortgage, I know you've heard kind of already today that 30% of your income on housing is what's considered affordable. And so we've got kind of a list here of what's calculated in that 30%. And I think this is the bottom of page 15. So the principal, right, the amount you're paying on your mortgage. In Habitat's case, there is no interest. We also do not have private mortgage insurance, and that again helps to make these homes affordable to folks at lower incomes. Property taxes, not a whole lot we can do about that. Homeowners insurance, and then if there is a community association, homeowners association, those dues are calculated in that 30% as well. And then sort of the right-hand side of that slide, I think gets into sort of how we calculate an affordable mortgage based on someone's income. So if we're looking to serve certain ranges of incomes, let's say folks around $50,000 as a gross annual income, if they can't pay more than 30% of their income on housing, that's a little over $1,200 a month. So you've got your fixed costs, right? Again, property taxes, which we can't do a lot about, insurance, association dues, and then Habitat will adjust its first mortgage, so the mortgage that's paid upon, to an amount that's affordable for that buyer. So in this scenario, that's a little over $300,000. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit about cost. And Alan mentioned this, it's true for affordable homeownership as well. Typically, every single home that we either build or rehab costs about $450,000 to $500,000 per unit. So pretty expensive. And then you've got a price that's affordable to someone at around $300,000 on a first mortgage. And what Habitat will oftentimes do is either assign or sell that mortgage to a bank. The bank has to keep it internally. They will service the mortgage. It's not something they can, bundle up and sell on Wall Street. They actually service it and hold it in-house. But what that allows Habitat to do is get 80% of all the future mortgage payments that would be paid back over 30 years. We get 80% of that today. And that's what we limit our construction loan to when we're building a house, so that we can pay off that construction loan with 80% of the first mortgage sale when we finish and sell the home. Everything else is equity or a subsidy into that home. So typically for Habitat, our subsidy is between $150,000 and $200,000 for every single home that we build. So how do we fill that? For the Randolph Road project, Jeff led a really successful capital campaign. We raised $1.5 million over just about under a year to build in the equity for that property. We also apply to private funders for grants, and also government agencies for government grants as well to help fill that subsidy gap. The Federal Home Loan Bank is also available as a financing source for homeownership, which is great. But homeownership really doesn't have the financing tools available that rental does. So there's not a low-income housing tax credit for homeownership yet, although we've been working on that for years at the federal level. But New Markets tax credits are tax credits sort of designed to reinvest in communities. And Habitat affiliates across the U.S. have figured out a way to use those as a financing source. So that is a potential additional financing source. It's not a super clear or simple process. It is very complicated, but it is an opportunity to build in that subsidy. And then Habitat uses a lot of in-kind donations and volunteer labor. So I know that some of you have volunteered with us. That volunteer labor saves us money. It reduces the cost. Same thing with in-kind donations of services and of materials as well. So it really is a bit of a puzzle on the ownership side, trying to put all of the subsidy pieces together. But it is something that is Habitat's strength. We've been doing that for now 41 years. And so to kind of wrap up this piece, again, there are challenges specific to homeownership. Like I mentioned, there are fewer financing tools. There is an extremely high subsidy per unit. We also have limited debt capacity, right? So we don't have rental income coming in year over year in perpetuity. We have that first mortgage price that we can sell up front for 80 cents on the dollar, and that's it, right? That's the entire amount of income we're going to get. So we can't continue to add certain kinds of debt that have to be repaid within a certain period of time or a short period of time. Property taxes are a huge challenge for this area, right? So if you think about when we have fixed costs and then our sort of fungible mortgage and principal amount, the higher property taxes are, the lower our mortgage amount has to be so that family is still not paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And so property taxes are a real difficulty in making homeownership affordable and also in the long run for the families buying houses. And then association fees. One of the challenges with condos, as I'm sure a lot of you have heard or know directly, are that condo fees can be extremely high. And so how do you get those down low enough to an amount that's affordable for lower income buyers? And I think Randolph Road is a really interesting property because we were able to address a lot of these challenges through that project. So co-location of homeownership and rental is absolutely critical. So we've got 195 total units, 27 ownership, but we are splitting costs on that site across 195 units rather than 27. So that builds on economies of scale. It drives our cost down per unit and drives down our subsidy per unit as well. And Alan kind of briefly mentioned this earlier, but the other really neat thing we're doing there is that our condo units are sharing property maintenance and property management costs with all of the rental units. So rather than the condo association having to do all of the lawn care and all of the long-term maintenance on the site, they're sharing those costs with a significant number of units and driving down the condo association fees. Habitat has also built 2 townhome communities. We still sit on those boards to make sure that they're running and functioning well. We sit in an advisory committee. We actually fund the reserve fund when we sell the condo units to the buyer so that they have a really significant reserve fund the second they move in. Because again, we really want folks to be successful. And then there are some interesting financing tools with sort of softer debt that can potentially sit on the house and only get repaid to a government agency upon resale of the property, like Habitat's Silent Second Loan. And we're doing that in the city of Tacoma Park. So they're investing very long-term dollars that they will only get back if and when the home is resold. But it's another sort of interesting finance tool that Habitat can look at to finance properties. So that's a really brief overview of how we finance homeownership and how we underwrite our mortgages, but happy to answer any questions if folks have them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That is handled by AHC. Yeah, so Habitat's mission is exclusively on access to and preservation of affordable homeownership. No, that's a great question. And so I think in terms of the percentages of rental versus homeownership, that's something that we can get into sort of in the visioning process. Yes, yeah. But on Randolph Road, we did kind of separate out the ownership buildings from the rental buildings. So we have 2 separate condo buildings. They only own the land right underneath their condo. And so we did separate it out to make the financing a little bit simpler. I definitely think that's a cleaner, easier way to go through the process. But it has been done where the units are within one building. It is a more complicated deal. Is there anything you would add to that?
Just if you picture that big skyscraper in New York, that's a hotel at the base and apartments in the middle and condos at the top. It's just, again, I've got to laugh before, but this is the stuff that lenders and attorneys love to figure out. If we can conceive of the vision, it's possible.
Yeah. Yeah, so I can answer on the homeownership side and then turn it over to Susan on the rental side. I would say typically what we find on the homeownership side is once you get folks into affordable, healthy, and stable housing, a lot of those challenges drop off. Many of our homeowners have gone back to school because they have the ability now to do so, and end up making a lot more money in the future than they were before. I'll say even during COVID, we have over 100 mortgages. I think 9 of our homeowners asked for a payment plan because of loss of income for COVID, and they all resolved that within 6 months. So we, on the homeownership side at least, we really don't find that to be a big challenge. But again, because Habitat is really connected with buyers, if they do find that there's a death in the family or some sort of financial hardship, we can certainly do a payment plan to make sure that folks can get caught up. But we haven't had that as a major issue on our side.
AHC has an eviction prevention program where we work with the property management company and my resident services team, and we are working with the residents. Pre-COVID, we were looking at when something came up, is it an individual situation or is this a more systemic structural issue? And then we would address that. We have social workers who are very knowledgeable of the resources in the community. Our governments also have eviction prevention dollars that we tie into on occasion. Since COVID, certainly the numbers are higher. It is a larger burden right now for folks than it was 3 years ago, and we are still working just as hard as we can and accessing the dollars that are there, and now focusing more on some workforce development to get people back to work.
So could rents go up or down depending on the person's income over time?
Only if they have subsidies. They typically, for a tax credit, if we were to have tax credit units, those rents remain the same or have a minimal increase. But if you're in a subsidized unit, whether you have a housing choice voucher or some other subsidy that the county or some other entity may have, that is absolutely based on income, and you will never go over 30%.
I know that there I have some general awareness that, at least across the nation, there are some rent-to-own models. I don't know if this is a concept that's happening in Montgomery County, but interested in if that's a potential option as well. So I appreciate only a 1% down payment with Habitat helps, but yeah.
No, that's a great question. I don't know if there are models in Montgomery County. It is not a model that Habitat does. We are not allowed by our charter to do any rental housing. And so Habitat specifically does not do a rent-to-own model. What I will say that I think is interesting about a model like Randolph Road is that you can kind of get into that, right? So you've got one site with rental opportunities and ownership opportunities. And you have to assume that some of those condos are going to turn over. They are family-sized condos, but typically condos are starter units for folks, right? And so as those ownership units begin to turn over, folks buy larger homes. Ideally, folks living in the rental units, right, will be in a more stable position to be able to then apply for those homes. And Habitat certainly does a significant amount of home buyer readiness and connections to credit counseling. So on another project we're doing with a church up in Gaithersburg, we are working with their congregants, years before any development and construction will happen, to make sure that folks are ready to apply for and purchase homes when they're available. So I think that there are ways to get folks ready, but in terms of a planned out rent-to-own program, it's not something that we do. All right, Alan, you want to close this out? No? So any additional questions from anyone before we? All right, well, from all of us, we really appreciate your time. Thank you.
So again, thank you to AHC and to Habitat for being with us today. Friends, just to kind of, again, clarify the importance of this, please sign up to participate in a roundtable to discuss what you've learned here, to learn from others who were at the last presentation that we had. Those are really where we're gathering up the information that should we empower a building committee, that committee will use to actually begin to clarify and make real some of the stuff we're learning about now. So I can't emphasize enough how important those roundtables are. And we know that you all have knowledge, experience, wisdom, and insight that we want to take into account. We'll close out today with a quick word of prayer and then move into the rest of our day. Let's pray. God, we give you thanks for the ways that you continue to reveal yourself to us in the beauty of this day and the gift of these relationships and the ways that our conversations and questions and hard-headedness all reveal new insights into ourselves and who you're calling us to be. We ask that you would continue to bless this conversation, this discernment process, and help us to lean ever more closely into the beloved community you're calling us to be. Go with us as we leave this place to keep us safe and to draw us back together safely again. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.